Hello, everybody. Another round with our friend Gianni Rizzello, whom you remember from the last video. I hope you remember him.
I do too.
This time, we're talking about sanctions, and it doesn't seem evident that someone who's specialized in aircraft transactions is also specializing in sanctions. However, in your case, that's true, right?
That's correct, yes.
How come?
Well, when we talk about sanctions, and in our discussion we're talking about sanctions against Russia, a number of questions have arisen in connection with aircraft that are owned by Russian individuals. As of today, it's a fact that aircraft owners who have Russian nationality, and independently whether they have another nationality or not next to the nationality, they're not allowed to have aircraft. So basically, when these sanctions got into place, it turned out over time that the only way that Russian owners of aircraft had was to sell their aircraft, independently whether they were specifically sanctioned as a person or not. So those who were sanctioned as individuals, obviously they're done anyway in respect of their aircraft. They can't even sell it, or if they can, it has to be a fully compliant procedure with the consent of the authorities. But this is an example how the sanctions affect a certain number of individuals that are not specifically targeted as individuals, but they are concerned or targeted just because they have a Russian passport.
And how do these sanctions work? I mean, perhaps we can explain a bit for people who don't know yet or are not concerned directly. The people directly concerned know in the meantime what it means, but many people don't know. What does it mean?
Well, there's a number of classifications of sanctions, and probably the most prominent that people are aware of are restrictions of financials. So basically assets of sanctioned individuals or companies are frozen. They cannot be used. They cannot be. You cannot give assets to such persons. And so basically they're cut off from their assets. That's one of the main sanctions. Then you have a number of other sanctions like sectoral sanctions, where you have certain sectors that are affected by sanctions with embargoes on goods to be delivered in certain areas. And it's a huge variety of different measures that are implemented in the sanctions cases. Main cases we are dealing with, I would say, are, given that we have a lot of exposure to aircraft transactions, always everything that, affects aircraft of both, I would say mainly of non-sanctioned individuals, because for the sanctioned individuals, all you can say is, no, you can't do anything, don't move. Yeah. And any contention of attorneys assisting in intricate ways of trying to evade the sanctions or circumvent the sanctions, we leave that up to the journalists. That this happens. It's not part of the business that we are doing. what I have observed is that these sanctions are very broad. So you would have questions like, when you talk about sanctions, you have the Swiss sanctions, which are taken over from Europe, basically, but then you also have US sanctions, you have UK sanctions. And a typical case is where you have an individual whose bank account is frozen in Switzerland, but this individual may only be sanctioned by a specific country, but not in Switzerland. And then you have all these questions, is there really a reason to freeze their assets in Switzerland or not? And these things can become quite complicated because it's not just cash accounts, but you also have accounts with securities that are then administered by a central depository, banks, which follow different rules. So you can be very quickly into a very complicated discussion.
But just to make it clear, I understand correctly that the sanctions do not concern primarily the list of people sanctioned, but other people not directly sanctioned in the consequences or in the effect of having to deal with sanctioned people, right?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Because most people, I suppose, don't know that. They think there's a list of people and yes, it's about them. But to my mind, it's rather easy with the people on the list.
Yeah.
It's difficult with people not on the list,
yeah,
right?
It's those people that, in my experience, there are, the most questions that arise, how to address that, how to make sure that they're actually not punished by regulations that are unclear, but they apply to them because they are unclear, but they shouldn't apply to them. And there's also a big, and it's one of the difficulties of the sanctions, there's a big, it's basically new land for Switzerland in particular. Now, I understand, there are UN sanctions that were taken over, but this particular way of how they implemented sanctions against Russia is something completely new for Switzerland. Now, there's no practice that has been established, so you cannot really call an authority and ask them, how are you handling this? I think it's only since, when they implemented the sanctions, it took a while to have questions and answers. So other jurisdictions like the US, they have, I don't know how many hundreds and thousands of FAQs where you can go and check how is a certain rule to be implemented. But this is one of the challenges in Switzerland from the outset, is to say, yes, okay, we have these sanctions now, but how does it work in particular? What does it mean in this particular case? Sometimes you would wait for 7-8 months for an answer, which is obviously entirely unacceptable. But you also have cases where you submit the question to SECO, the Swiss authority, and ask, is this bank allowed to make this payment? You get an answer within a reasonable period of time. And then you send the answer of SECO to the bank and says, yes, you're allowed to make this payment. And the bank says, no, we're not going to make the payment because we have other issues, reservations, whatever.
Yeah. Other interests.
Yeah, other interests.
Basically, no, I mean, it's completely acceptable that the bank has interests of their own.
Yeah.
But the point is, it's difficult for you as a client of the bank if your interests are different from the bank's interest.
Yes, of course, because you're cut off from your money.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Could it be? I mean, perhaps not everybody knows that Switzerland does normally not have, did never have, and doesn't have proper sanctions, Swiss sanctions, but
right,
usually takes sanctions of other countries, of the UN or the EU, or as the law says, of our main business partners, and implements them so that it's not properly our sanctions, but rather taken over from other countries. So the other countries might have experience with their sanctions, of course. And my difficulty was always, or my question was always, how do we know which sanctions are important and which not? I mean, the EU or the UN, Canada has its own sanctions, Japan has its own sanctions, of course, Ukraine has its own sanctions. I don't know, there are about 20, 25 different sanction jurisdictions or sanction systems. Which one is important? Which one counts? Essentially, if I have a deal between 2 or 3 parties.
It's very difficult to I mean, you mean in respect of a specific.
Yes.
You really have to look at each regime, you know, whether it applies. So give you an example. You're saying Switzerland takes over the EU sanctions based on the Embargo Act of the most important trading partners, I think it's stated. Now, the EU has a provision of non-circumvention. Specifically, it's forbidden to circumvent the sanctions. The Swiss don't have that. They didn't take this over. Now, is it less important for Switzerland? I don't know. But what is a circumvention? So isn't it just, you know, you read the text of the law and then either you do this and whatever else you do that's not prohibited is allowed and thus not a circumvention? Or could it be a circumvention just because the text doesn't go far enough? I don't know. But back to your question, you really have to go through the, you know, who are the parties, what's the jurisdiction, what's the business. Then, for example, Europe sanctions do apply to EU citizens no matter where they are situated in the world, as far as I remember. Switzerland has a different concept, although they took over the European sanctions, but it's a different approach. And then, you know, you have to run through these provisions, different provisions, and piece it together, probably get opinions from other countries, from law firms that are practicing in the other jurisdictions. There's no other way around it, you know. And then plus you should build in, if you give the advice, you have to build in some additional comfort to make sure that, you know, it could be that this is considered as a circumvention, even though it may be very far-fetched, but you never know.